Hmm. Well, here we are. It is Monday, June 26, 2023. I'm Larissa, and I just completed my new novel. I'm going to start reading it. I was hoping to get to do some more edits, but for some reason I can't print. So it's hard for me. I prefer doing edits on paper, but whatever. So let's see what we got here. A novel, When It Becomes Too Much. When It Becomes Too Much by Larissa. There's a difference between enough and too much. This book is dedicated to those who know the difference. Prologue. There's a lot, enough. The best, the most, the least, and not enough. Then there's too much. It's hard being a human being. We struggle to live and make ends meet. On any given day, any given person is dealing with something that could very well destroy another person, yet you wouldn't know. We never know for sure what the stranger next to us on the street has been through, or is going through, or is going to go through. So, what is too much? How do we know when something has been too much? What happens when things just become too much? In this novel, I wanted to explore average, ordinary, everyday people who already carry significant stress and figure out what too much means. It's one thing to have had enough. It's something else to have had too much. Having had enough usually means we decide to make a change of some sort. Having had too much can be fatal. And what is too much for one person might be just enough for someone else. That is what makes the question interesting to look at, both from a human and a literary perspective. What happens? What does it mean? How do we cope when it becomes too much? When It Becomes Too Much is an original work of fiction by Larissa. Any resemblance of any character or event to any real-life person or event is pure coincidence and not meant to disparage or mock any actual person or event. Cover photo by Larissa. Chapter 1. A lot of potato salad. Ruth shook the water from the bunch of parsley in her hands over the sink. Cool drops flicked up into her face, and she squinted her eyes. A small beetle stumbled out from her loose fist and made its way over her thumb towards her wrist. Ruth watched the tiny legs of the insect moving moving frantically before shaking the unsuspecting critter into the sink. For a moment, she was a small girl in her grandmother's kitchen holding a bunch of fresh-picked parsley from the garden like a bunch of roses. Grandma's parsley always filled the planter box. Grandma's parsley also tasted better. None of the produce from the market tasted anything like the fruits and veggies she remembered from her grandma's garden. Ruth couldn't remember when the change happened. It was so gradual, but then again, it seemed like just yesterday Ruth took a bite out of a store-bought apple and crinkled her nose at the lack of flavor. Ruth chopped the parsley coarsely and sprinkled it over the bowl of potato salad in front of her on the counter. She had promised she would bring a bowl of potato salad to the picnic. Ruth's potato salad was well known among the office picnic crowd. Last time, for the January through March birthdays picnic, Elizabeth insisted her German potato salad was better and that she would make the potato salad. Ruth didn't care. It burned her hands to peel the hot potatoes the way her recipe required, and she was more than happy to let Elizabeth bring her German potato salad. Besides, everyone liked a vodka watermelon too, and the watermelon was way more fun anyway. It ended up no one ate any of Elizabeth's potato salad except Elizabeth, and then a couple folks got extra honest after eating the vodka watermelon and told Elizabeth that her German potato salad was horrible. Just let Ruth make hers next time. Elizabeth had cried. Her potato salad was terrible. The dressing was far too sweet, and she used Miracle Whip instead of real mayo, and who used Yukon Gold potatoes to make potato salad anyway? The nerve. Ruth's palms were still red from peeling the hot potatoes when her phone rang. Ruth used her pinky knuckle to answer the cell phone on the counter and put it on intercom so she didn't need to hold the phone to her ear or wash her hands immediately. It was Brian, the only person in the office she ever went out with for lunch. "Are you almost done with the potato salad?" Brian asked impatiently. "Oh my God, Brian, I don't even like potato salad, you know?" It was true. Ruth didn't like potatoes, not even French fries. She preferred rice be the starch on her plate. She had just made it once for an office potluck, and Debbie had gone on about it for over a week. So now Ruth had to make it for every office potluck. You know, it's not really about the potato salad. It's about Debbie, and we aren't going to have to look at her big sticky wig or laugh at one of her stupid jokes ever again. Brian was right. Neither of them would have to humor Debbie ever again. Debbie had been the office manager for their department for the past 5 years. No one liked her. She micromanaged everything and insisted on these nearly monthly picnics where everyone brought something for potluck and pretended to be friends for a couple hours. Once a quarter, they celebrated birthdays, and if it wasn't a birthday celebration month, Debbie found something else to celebrate. She made up awards or moving on parties, etc. Debbie wore wigs, and they were poorly dressed, held in place in awkward shapes with too much hairspray and bobby pins. Everyone made fun of her behind her back, and now she was getting a promotion and being moved to another campus to torment a new group of office workers into celebrating birthdays and made up awards and pretend like they liked each other's company. I wonder if it has ever occurred to her that her wig could use a washing, Ruth said absently to Brian as she rinsed off her hands and dried them on some paper towel. She pressed a lid over the potato salad and pushed it onto the shelf in her refrigerator. I don't know how she can't smell them. Between the hairspray and her scalp grease, I can't believe her dog doesn't go after them, mistaking them for being their own autonomous animal. Brian wasn't exaggerating. The wig smelled and looked that bad. Ruth believed Debbie was being pushed along because no one wanted to actually tell her the truth, that her physical presence was nearly intolerable. There just didn't seem to be any nice way to tell an older single woman who lived alone with a grizzled little one-eyed dog that she smelled bad and was annoying. At least this is the last time I will need to make this giant vat of potato salad, Ruth told Brian, who listened sympathetically on the other end of the phone. What did you end up making this time? She asked Brian. Oh, you know I didn't make a damn thing. I got a few dozen cups and some 2 liters of Coke and Sprite and ice. Did you get any diet? Last time Candy almost hyperventilated over there not being any Diet Coke, Ruth reminded Brian. I got some Diet Coke, and it's warm, and it has Candy's name on it, Brian retorted. Ruth didn't really care. She would stick to the flat of bottled water she kept hidden under her own desk. She didn't drink any kinds of soft drinks anyway. Well, okay, are you going to pick me up today, or am I hoofing it? Ruth only lived 3 blocks from the office. I'll be there in like 20 minutes. Just be waiting up front, Brian offered. Okay, see you soon. Ruth hung up and caught a reflection in the high polish of her stainless steel refrigerator. It was a bit distorted, but she could still see the scar spidering over her right clavicle under her t-shirt dress. She ran her palm over the scar and sniffed absently. It had been 10 years now. The scar had softened some, but it never went away like the doctor had made her hope it would. She still rubbed cocoa butter on it every night before she got in bed, hoping it would fade, but it didn't. The scar wasn't what was bad. It was the story that sucked, and whenever anyone saw the scar, they asked, and Ruth was tired of telling the story. Sometimes she just made up some crazy story when people rudely asked about the unusual purple scar they frequently mistook at first to be a tattoo of an alien spaceship shooting lightning. She would come up with the most ridiculous explanation she could concoct while also keep a straight face and see if she could get people to believe it. Last week she told a woman in a restroom while she was washing her hands that she had been attacked by leeches in the rainforest while on vacation. The woman bought it, and Ruth was saved from telling another person the truth, that a homeless person was hiding in her car one evening and cut her with a rusty screwdriver, demanding a McDonald's Happy Meal. No, the homeless person was never caught, and Ruth was still on the lookout for his face. People were often offended when Ruth told them the actual story behind her scar, and this confused her. She didn't understand why anyone should be offended by her story. It wasn't her fault that homelessness existed, yet folks often seemed upset with her when she explained how she smelled the guy in her car before she saw him, how he had spat in her face after he had stabbed her, and run off with her purse and the $5 bill she had tucked in her wallet since high school in case of an emergency. She had laughed to herself at the time, thinking how the Happy Meal would cost more than her emergency $5 bill. Ruth stood on the stoop in front of her townhouse and waited for Brian to pull up to the curb with his beat-up old Ford Escort wagon. They often joked about the car being an old hooker. Brian wasn't sure how it kept going. Ruth appreciated the old tape deck in the dashboard, and Brian had a box full of old mixtapes he had made in the early 90s when the car had been new. 35 years later, and Brian's Pet Shop Boys and Cyndi Lauper mix was every bit as much fun as it had been back when Ruth and Brian had been teens. The two friends didn't know each other when they were in high school. Ruth had been on the East Coast back then, but the two of them got on and understood each other so well, most people just assumed they had been friends since they were kids, and they didn't usually bother to correct anyone. Brian pulled up to the curb, and Ruth heaved herself into the front seat with a giant bowl of potato salad. Brian's back seat was covered in bottles of Coke and Sprite and a couple bottles of Diet Coke. "I wonder who will replace Debbie," Brian said softly as Ruth buckled herself in and situated the big bowl in her lap. "I don't know," Ruth said. She'd been thinking about it that morning, too. Besides Cheryl retiring 2 years ago, the only change that happened in their little office group had been 5 years ago when Debbie was hired as manager. Ruth wondered if they were going to bring in a new manager or promote someone from the team. She and Brian had been on the team the longest after Debbie. Brian would make a horrible manager. He was always looking for a way to slip out early, and Ruth wasn't interested. Ruth wasn't interested in anything that gave her any more responsibility than she already had. Signing for the deliveries of light bulbs, paper towels, chalk, and floor wax was already more than she wanted to answer for. Signing time cards and approving overtime were way above any pay grade she wanted to be counted among. The additional $3 or $4 an hour wasn't worth the extra paperwork, and she knew it. Plus, there were the extra weekly managers' meetings with the directors, and Ruth knew she hated those people since the Christmas party 2 months after her accident. She had just started coming back into the office after the attack. Tom Gruder, director of their department, had gotten very drunk and slid his bare hand over the healing wound and Ruth's breast while standing in line for the punch bowl. In some ways, Tom's grope had been worse than the attack. 2 other directors had been standing around and laughed as Ruth had pulled her blouse near her chin and walked off towards the ladies' room to gather her dignity. Brian had used it as an excuse to talk Ruth into going home early. It had turned out to be a good call. There was an I Love Lucy marathon on some channel that night, and Brian and Ruth ordered pizzas and stayed up like schoolgirls, watching, eating pizza, and drinking wine coolers. In the morning, Brian went back to the apartment he shared with his blind mother and her 4 cats. Twice a year, Brian's older sister came to stay for a month to give Brian a break from watching after their mother. During that time, Ruth and Brian usually went for a long weekend at a spa or wine tasting. Brian was gay but had given up dating after the older guy he had been dating when Brian was 19 turned out to be married and shared HIV with him. Brian was now at an undetectable level, but he had been left totally disillusioned by romantic relationships. Besides, most guys were turned off when they learned about Brian's role as caregiver for his elderly mother, especially when they figured out she wasn't rich, just old and blind. Ruth had given up on dating after the assault. She had just started at the office 6 months before the attack and met Brian when she was assigned the cubicle next to his. Both got along well before the attack, but after the attack they became closer much faster because Ruth became cynical. The relationship had served both friends well. Whenever the need for a +1 or a date arose, they had each other, no strings or expectations or questions attached. They were like an old married couple, except they never had sex. In all honesty, the relationship wasn't much different than the one Ruth had observed between her own mother and father. Ruth hadn't seen them since before the attack. Ruth wasn't really sure what happened. After the attack, no one in her family wanted anything to do with her. It was like they blamed her for the attack and were still holding it against her. At first, it had been hard, but Brian had come to fill all the relationship needs Ruth had in life, and Ruth did the same for Brian. Brian pulled a collapsible cart out of the trunk of his Escort and was stacking the bottles of soft drink as Ruth shut the car door behind her, balancing the potato salad on one hip. "I hope there's room in the refrigerator for this bowl," Ruth said as Brian tucked stacked cups under his arm. "As long as Rita doesn't bring a giant bowl of that whip and chill again," Brian laughed. I didn't even know anyone still made that stuff. Last time I had a bowl of that, I was still a virgin." Ruth grimaced at Brian's last remark as she spied Rita across the parking lot with a big bowl of something. "Rita's over there right now with some giant bowl. I'm getting in there so I can fit this in the fridge before her," Ruth said to Brian, taking off at a brisk pace towards the door to the building. Brian didn't care. He was going to need to make a second trip out to the car to bring in the ice and coolers. Ruth made it into the break room well before Rita and her bowl of whip and chill. She was closing the refrigerator door when Tom Gruder came in and caught Ruth licking some mayo off her thumb. "I hope you brought some of that potato salad, Ruth," Tom said lamely, then added, "Please meet me in my office once you get your purse and things put away at your desk. I need to talk to you about something." Ruth was a little nervous. Tom had never asked to speak with her alone since the Christmas party incident, and no one had ever brought it up again other than Brian when they were alone outside of work. "Okay," Ruth said hesitantly as she walked toward her cube and Tom walked off towards his office. Ruth could see Brian struggling in front of the front door with 2 coolers full of ice stacked behind him. She knocked on Tom's door and waited. She could hear Tom on the phone on the other side of the door. "Yeah, Bill, I'm about to talk to her about it now. Let me call you back in a bit." Ruth heard Tom cradle his phone, then call out to her. "Come on in, Ruth." Ruth pushed open the door to see Tom standing on the far side of his desk with a stack of papers spread all over. Tom scrambled to pick up the displayed stack of papers and tuck them in a basket on a shelf behind his desk. "Hi, Ruth. I wanted to talk to you before the day got started. Please have a seat." He nodded to a chair just to Ruth's right. Ruth pulled it out and sat down on the edge of the seat. Tom smiled somewhat nervously as he sat down in the chair across from her. "So everybody knows Debbie is moving on to work with folks at HQ, but we still have an open position here, and Bill and I thought it would be a good time for you to take on some new responsibility. Plus, it's a bit of a raise. Not much, but $4 more an hour." Ruth was making $24 an hour, so the raise would bring her up to $28 an hour. It would still be less than $60,000 a year. Ruth was more than a little disappointed. "Bill and I are going to announce your promotion at the picnic." Ruth just nodded. "We can let everything just settle for today, but the first thing we need you to do tomorrow is to let Brian Strodman go. He's been skipping out early every Friday for the past 6 months, and Bill already gave him 2 second chances," Tom finished. Surely Tom knew Brian and Ruth were friends. Everyone knew that. Ruth was resigned to the idea of the new position until this last bit. There was no way she could fire Brian. Without a second thought, Ruth sighed and shrugged. "Tom, Brian is my closest friend. Everyone knows that. I can't fire him," Ruth said. "Well, you're going to have to, or you both are going to go," he said. "Then we both go," Ruth said, and turned and walked out of the office before Tom could say anything else. Ruth walked back to her cube and found Brian laughing with Rita over her bowl of whip and chill. Ruth grabbed his shirt from his shoulder. "Come on, let's go," she said, swinging her purse over her arm. "You're fired and I quit." Rita and Brian stopped laughing. Rita picked up her bowl of whip and chill and headed toward the break room. Brian looked long and hard at Ruth, trying to decipher whether or not she was joking. "What are you talking about?" he asked finally. Ruth just looked at him with a flat expression and told him what had happened when she put her potato salad away. "Come on, grab the couple personal things from your desk and let's go. They can have the potato salad and the pop. Let's go home," Ruth said to Brian, who was already stuffing a framed photo of him, Ruth, and his mom at Red Lobster from last Mother's Day into his backpack. Chapter 2. Just do 2 chapters. A lot of freedom. Brian stuck his key in the ignition as Ruth buckled up. "Are you sure, Ruth? Just because they're firing me doesn't mean you need to quit." Ruth looked out the window as she answered him. "No, they said if I couldn't fire you, that I was gone too, so I'm gone too." "It's not like it was a great job or anything," Ruth said to Brian as he pulled out of the parking space he had been using for the past 12 years. "No, it wasn't," Brian agreed. Ruth dug in the console between her and Brian, looking for the mixtape with Rock the Casbah and Private Idaho. "I think what you're looking for is already in the deck," Brian told Ruth as he pressed play. Ruth smiled and tapped the beat out on the dashboard in front of her. "Let's drive down to Monterey and have shrimp cocktails on the beach," Ruth said wistfully. "I don't know, Ruth. You got another job up your sleeve or something? I don't have rent to worry about, but you do," Brian said like a protective big brother might. "Oh, I don't care. I'll worry about it tomorrow. Right now, I just want to enjoy all this freedom. Don't you? I mean, fuck all that potato salad and Debbie's wigs." Ruth pouted. Brian laughed. "Okay, whatever you say, but don't say I didn't warn you." Brian laughed and gave the little buggy of a car some gas. Ruth rolled down her window and let the warm, early summer air wash over her face. Her hair blew around her head, and the white hairs caught the sunlight. "Your white hairs look like you paid a bunch of money for highlights," Brian told her. He was always telling Ruth this. It made Ruth feel old, not thrifty. "Oh, I've had white hair since high school," Ruth protested, and she had. She was the only girl she knew of to have honest-to-goodness white hairs in high school. Brian pulled the elastic out of his messy hair and let his shoulder-length black hair blow around like Ruth's brown and white salt and pepper. Traffic was light, and they made it from San Jose down to Monterey in under 40 minutes. A mile before the exit off the freeway, Ruth looked over at Brian, who was singing along to a song they always did together when they went out for karaoke. "Let's keep going. Who wants to hang out in Monterey?" "What? But I thought you wanted to get shrimp cocktails on the beach." "Shrimp cocktails are okay, but don't you feel rare today? Tom gave us all this freedom. Don't you want to do something wild with it?" "Well, like what? You want to go down to San Luis Obispo and pick up ex-cons at the train station or something? Because you're on your own if that's what you have in mind." Brian was pulling the car into a gas station parking lot. Ruth dug around in her purse and pulled out a $10 bill and handed it to Brian. "For gas," she said. Brian filled the tank, then stumbled into the station. When he came out, he had 2 giant fountain drinks and a big bag of Funyuns. He handed one of the fountain drinks to Ruth. It was some red slushy thing that she never would have bought for herself. She stuck the straw in her mouth and took a long sip until she got a brain freeze and squealed. "Well, what'd you expect?" Brian said, sipping his slushy. "I never drink these things, you know," Ruth said to Brian. "Yeah? But live a little, why don't you?" Brian joked. "So where are we going?" he asked Ruth seriously. "I don't know," Ruth offered. "We could drive down to Laguna and take pictures of weightlifters." "I don't want to drive that far, Ruth, and I certainly don't want to stay overnight anywhere. Let's just go back to my mom's place and see if Janie is home and can do our toes." Brian wiggled his toes in his flip-flops. His black polish was chipped. Janie worked at one of the Vietnamese nail salons in Cupertino, but she did Brian's mom's nails and hair for her in her home once a month, and if Brian and Ruth were around, she did theirs too. Janie wasn't Vietnamese. She was Korean, so she wasn't expected to be family with Hong and her brother Vu, who owned the shop where she worked. Patty, Brian's mom, was happy to not have to go into a salon. She never got polish on her nails, and her hair was simple and straight. She always just pulled it back at the nape of her neck, so it wasn't a lot of work for Janie. It was a real easy $40 for her, truth be told. Patty hadn't always been blind. She had gone blind a few years back when her diabetes got really bad out of the blue. She went from being a seeing person to totally blind in 6 months. Up until then, she only walked with a cane because of the neuropathy in her legs. The loss of her sight was when she officially became disabled in the eyes of the state, and Brian was able to apply to become her IHSS worker. Patty was approved for 25 hours of assistance a week. The extra 375 a week was nice for Brian. He had been doing all the laundry and cleaning the bathrooms for years already anyway. Now he got paid to do it. Patty was only recently getting used to being blind finally. For the first year or so, you couldn't even mention it in her presence. Ruth couldn't blame her. She tried walking around her own apartment with her eyes closed and a bandana tied around her face once after Patty lost her sight. She only made it 15 minutes before she was so frustrated she called it quits. So she tried to be gentle with Brian's mom. Patty had always been nice to Ruth. She confided to Ruth once that she held a small hope that Brian would just bite the bullet and ask Ruth to marry him, though she was totally aware and accepted that Brian was gay. Ruth had just laughed. Patty told her she wasn't getting any younger either, and didn't her mother want grandchildren? This was when Ruth explained to Patty that she didn't really have a family. No, she didn't know why. Patty felt bad and never brought it up again. "I just gave you the last cash I had in my wallet, Bri," Ruth said. "Janie's going to want paid too." Brian opened up his wallet. It was stuffed with 20s. "My treat, Ruth. Come on, let's get our toes did." Brian wiggled his toes at Ruth before putting the car in gear and pulling out of the gas station parking lot. Back at Patty and Brian's apartment, the cats were meowing as normal. Bert, the oldest one, was particularly vocal. It had been helpful since Patty lost her sight. He always let her know where he was so she didn't sit or step on him. Olive was Bert's litter mate. She was quiet, but she never sat on any of Patty's favorite spots, so she avoided being sat on as well. Melba and Spritzer sometimes got stepped or sat on. But they seemed to actually like it. It was only Patty who seemed annoyed. Ruth assumed correctly that it only bothered Patty because she resented the loss of her sight. Janie was bringing a couple bags of groceries in from her car when Brian and Ruth pulled in the apartment parking garage. Brian parked and hopped out, smiling at Janie, his lips and tongue reddened from the slushy like a kid. "Hey, Janie, any chance you could do some toes for us? It's a special kind of day," he joked. Janie cocked her head to one side. "A special kind of day?" she asked. "Yeah, we got fired. Well, I got fired. Ruth just quit," Brian answered. Janie didn't see how this was funny or any kind of joke. "What are you going to do, Brian?" Janie asked in all seriousness. "Oh, probably just go suck dicks at the truck stop with Vu." Vu was the brother and part owner of the salon where Janie worked. He was gay too and was known to frequent the truck stop on weekends. Janie laughed. "Yeah, I can do your toes after I get my groceries put away," Janie told Brian. "I'll knock on the door when I'm done. See you in a minute. Does your mom want her toes done too?" "I don't know. You'll have to ask her," Brian said over his shoulder. Ruth was already opening the gate to the hallway. She could see the elevator was coming down from the top floor. "Hurry up, Brian. The elevator's almost here." 3 teenage boys got off the elevator, swearing and spitting on the floor. Brian scowled at them as they brushed past him in the hall. Ruth was holding the elevator door open. "Come on," she told him. Brian was still glaring at the boys. Ruth pulled her hand away from the door, allowing it to close quickly behind Brian. "They are so gross. I said something to the mom the other day about all the spitting. It's not like they need to spit." "They're just boys, Brian. They could do a lot worse." "I guess so, but the spitting is gross." Ruth was looking down at her toes and her sandal wedges. The pale pink polish was chipped, and her right big toenail was torn. "Hey, I don't have any polish with me. Can I use yours?" Ruth asked Brian. Usually she kept her polish colors very neutral for work, but today was a special day. Maybe she would choose one of Brian's glitter colors. Yeah, I guess so, but keep your toe cheese to yourself, he joked. Ruth rolled her eyes. Patty was listening to reruns of Jeopardy when they walked in. She turned, startled to hear the door open at an odd time of day. Brian, is that you? She called from the couch. Yeah, Mom, it's me and Ruth. Hi, Ruth. Why aren't you guys at work? Patty asked. Oh, I got fired and Ruth quit. I told you they were going to fire you, Patty scolded Brian. You come home early almost every Friday. Whatever, Mom. You'd be looking to leave every chance you got too if you worked there. I don't think I'd be looking at much of anything if I worked there, Patty corrected Brian, reminding him of her lack of sight. Janie's coming up to do our toes, Mom. You need yours done too? Patty wiggled her toes and scrunched her nose. No, she just did them for me last week, but you guys go on. Patty hoisted herself up from her seat on the couch and was feeling her way towards the bathroom. Melba ran under her feet and almost tripped her. Damn you, Melba, Patty cried. Ruth sat next to where Patty had been sitting, and Melba hopped up next to her, purring. Brian disappeared into his bedroom. He reappeared quickly with a box. He placed the box on the couch between he and Ruth and started pulling out colors of polish. Let's see. Hooker red, clown show orange, pond scum green. Brian picked up bottles of polish and tossed them at Ruth's lap, where they landed next to a very offended Melba. No, I think I want some glitter, Brian. You have something sparkly? What? Oh my, it is a special kind of day. Ruth is going to get glitter polish on her toes? Melba, call the paper. This is news. Brian rubbed Melba's head before she jumped down to look for the litter box. Ruth dug in the box and pulled out a bottle of chunky-looking gold glitter polish. Brian had gotten it last Christmas for the holiday party. From Black Friday to New Year's Day, he had worn nothing but metallic gold everything. Patty said she could even see him coming down the hall. This was a total exaggeration. Patty couldn't see anything. Sometimes Brian said he walked around naked just to make a point. Ruth had never seen Brian naked, and neither did Patty. Janie knocked at the door. It's Janie, she called. Come in, Janie, it's open, Brian said. Janie pushed the door open and was carrying her tools in an apron pocket. In the hallway, she bent over to bring in her stool and the foot bathtub. Ruth's getting gold glitter, Brian announced triumphantly to Janie. Well, this must be a special day, Janie said, looking at Ruth with surprise. Ruth just shrugged. Well, why in the hell not? I'm allowed to live a little too, you know, Janie. Ruth was starting to be annoyed by the attention her attitude was attracting. What was so odd about her wanting glittery toes anyway? It's not like anyone ever looked at her feet to begin with. She hardly even bothered to look at them herself. Ruth is having a midlife crisis, Janie, Brian explained. She quit her job, and now she wants to be a movie star. He finished pulling his trusty bottle of black polish out and sat it decisively on the table. Do Miss Ruth's toes first, Janie, before she decides to use that tired old Queen Elizabeth pink again. Janie chuckled and took the foot spa into the kitchen to fill with warm water. Ruth glared at Brian, who wasn't even looking at her. Patty came back out of the bathroom now with her blind person stick, tapping in front of her. Janie, is my Brian giving you a hard time again? Patty called into the kitchen as she passed by on her way to the recliner in the corner of the room. Oh, goodness, no, Patty. Brian couldn't give me a hard time if he tried. Are you sure you don't need your toes scrubbed and trimmed while I'm here? No, I'm fine, but do whatever you can to fix Brian. He must be a mess. He hasn't had a date in years. Patty didn't exaggerate. Ruth was the closest thing to a date, and everyone knew she didn't count, especially Ruth. Brian, you remember your cousin Sydney, your dad's brother, Melvin's daughter? She called yesterday and wanted to talk to you. Brian took a break from organizing his box of polish and looked over at his mother, who was carefully feeling the seat of her recliner to check that it was cat-free before she sat down. Sydney called me? What on earth for? Brian sounded annoyed. The last time he saw Sydney, they were both 13 at his father's funeral. Brian's father had been an enormously fat Hawaiian man and had died of heart failure long before Ruth and Brian met. At 13, Brian hadn't been out of the closet yet. He told Sydney over fried spam and fruit salad at the funeral luncheon that he had kissed the neighbor boy and got an erection, and she had taken it upon herself to tell all the aunties. By the end of the day, no one was talking about Brian's dead father, only Brian's preference for penis. Brian told Ruth about it the night they had watched I Love Lucy instead of staying at the company Christmas party. He still hadn't forgiven Sydney, and he had no idea why she would be calling him now. How is Melvin anyway, Mom? Evidently he's dying, Patty blurted. I think that's why she wants to talk to you. I think she feels bad. I doubt it, Brian said. If she's feeling bad, it's probably just for her own sorry self. She has always been a selfish bitch. Well, that's your father's family for you, Bry Guy. I told you that back then. But other than to tell you her dad's dying, I don't know what she wants. She said she needed to talk to you. I wrote her number down over there by the phone. Well, I wrote it down as best I could anyway. Whatever. I'll call her later if I feel like it, Brian said, watching Janie trim Ruth's cuticles and sand her heels. Ruth kept her mouth shut, but she wished but she wished one of her cousins would call her. It would be nice to hear from one of them, especially Anne or Gloria. They had been close those summers she had spent with her grandma, almost like sisters. They'd stopped calling after they heard about the attack, too. Ruth didn't get it, and while she had gotten over the rest of the family acting like she didn't exist anymore, Anne and Gloria still hurt. Olive sauntered in the room from Brian's bedroom and curled up next to Ruth on the couch. Ruth rubbed Olive's old kitty face. Olive and Bert were nearly 18 years old. They were living on borrowed time. Janie finished painting Ruth's toes and picked up the foot bath to change the water for Brian's toes. Ruth stretched out her legs and looked at her strangely sparkling appendages. She had to admit, they did seem strange. "Well, that's not something you see every day," Ruth said out loud. "I don't see anything any day," Patty replied. "Yeah, everyone gets it," Ruth said. "You're blind." Ruth carefully slipped her sandals back on and got up and walked toward the door. "Thanks, Janie. Brian said it was his treat today," Ruth called into the kitchen as she walked out the door without saying a word more to any of her friends. Brian and Patty were just too much in this moment, and she wanted to go home and be alone. It was only a 2-mile walk, and the weather was pleasant enough. Janie waved at Ruth's back as the door closed between them. So, that's the story. Yeah. The first 2 chapters, huh? First 2 chapters. There's 14 chapters total, so probably do this in 7 installments then. 2 chapters an installment. Newest novel. Just finished. Hot off my fingertips.